this block of presentations. Our next presenter is Karen Fukuda, and she will be presenting on education in context, examining attitudes towards sexual assault in Japan and developing an educational tool for high school students. As you might be able to tell from the title, this might have some sensitive content that is nevertheless important to talk about, so viewer discretion is advised.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Please just give me a second. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Karen Fukuda, and for my research project, I decided to examine attitudes towards sexual assault in Japan. So before I get started, I just kind of wanted to talk about why I got interested in this issue. So the reason I decided to dive deeper into this topic is because of the stories of two influential women, Chessie Prout and Shiori Ito. Chessie Prout was raped when she was a freshman in high school. The perpetrator was a senior and also her friend. Shiori Ito, a Japanese journalist, came forward in 2017 with her story of being raped by a prominent news journalist in Japan. Both of these women's experiences shocked me, not only in the nature of the crime, but more so in the aftermath. Both women faced severe backlash from their peers and surrounding society after sharing their story. Particularly, Shiori Ito's story made me wonder. What are the attitudes surrounding sexual violence in Japan, and how can we address those attitudes with cultural sensitivity? Attitudes surrounding sexual violence are an aspect of gender inequality because they encompass a society's perception of gender roles. Therefore, examining these attitudes can give insight into the culture that surrounds sexual assault and the way that survivors are treated within their communities. Japan is a country in which many are reluctant to speak out about this issue. This reluctance to discuss the topic has allowed room for harmful attitudes toward the crime to persist, thereby burying survivors into further shame. Today in my presentation, I'm going to be first talking about my methods, then a bit about what I discovered, and finally, I will be introducing an educational tool that I created to address some of the issues that I bring up later in this presentation. So first, my methods. Something I want to note is that when I referred to attitudes towards sexual assault, my research primarily focused on the experience of survivors who are women. So first, to get a background on the attitudes toward this issue, I examined a variety of academic papers. However, I soon realized that not much was published specific to Japan. And this makes sense because of the silence that pervades this topic here. Therefore, I had to branch out to more non-academic sources, such as documentaries and organizations. And from there, I was able to understand the attitudes surrounding this issue and how it's discussed here in Japan. Next, I started looking for solutions. What's the best way to speak out about a serious yet taboo topic? Academic papers pointed to education as a key factor in increasing awareness and improving attitudes toward this issue. From there, I investigated Japan's sexual assault education, and I found that not many resources are available for high school students. Therefore, I started to research ways about how to teach about sexual violence in a way that high school students in Japan would be most receptive to. So now I'm going to be discussing my discoveries. Among the many things that I discovered, the two main destructive attitudes toward the crime in Japan are clouded views of consent and the tendency to blame the victim. Why do these two attitudes exist? I've discovered two main reasons. One, the law, and two, traditional gender roles. First, I'm going to talk about the law. So Japan's Penal Code for sexual offenses was created in 1907. This version of the law restricted the crime of rape to cases where the victim was female. This original code lasted until the first major revision in 2017. That's 110 years. Although this revision redefined rape to include all genders as victims, the current version still defines the crime very narrowly. Unless force, violence, or intimidation can be proven, the crime is not considered for rape. So what does all of this mean? Basically, the law restricts rape to cases where the perpetrator takes advantage of the victim's inability to resist. Broadly speaking, this means that lack of consent is simply not enough to convict the perpetrator. The problem here is that the reality and the complexity of the crime is not adequately reflected in the law. Rape is not a straightforward crime. In some cases, there's clear evidence that the perpetrator took advantage of the victim's inability to resist, such as in cases where the victim is unconscious. In other cases, however, such as in spousal or partner rape, there is a possibility that no force or violence was present, and rather that the victim just said no. But in Japan, saying no is not enough. The law makes it the victim's responsibility to physically resist. Only in the case that they are not able to resist due to force or violence, then is a crime considered for rape. Furthermore, the law excludes psychological factors that can contribute to an inability to resist. The law makes it the victim's responsibility to say no, when in fact consent should never be assumed unless there's a yes. By drawing a fine line for consent, the law reinforces societal attitudes toward the crime that burdens the victim with the responsibility of the perpetrator's actions. Secondly, I want to talk about the expected behaviors of gender in Japan and how they tie to victim blaming. In Japan, gender roles are very complex, especially for women. Here, women are expected to be compliant with inappropriate advances, but at the same time are expected to be responsible enough to turn those advances down. This expected behavior of women is present in other countries. However, it's particularly reinforced in Japan. This is because in Japan, public expressions of dissent with the norm are uncommon, if not taboo. Especially for women who voice their opinion, they can sometimes be seen as unfeminine. As you can see, these attitudes toward the crime are very complex, and they tie directly to victim blaming. These various factors are what make it extremely difficult for survivors who are women to speak out about their experiences. So what can be done to address these attitudes toward consent and victim responsibility? Through my research, I've discovered that education can be a key factor in increasing knowledge about the issue as well as improving attitudes toward survivors. However, in Japan, there is no standardized curriculum for sexual assault education. Without strict guidelines, teachers are free to skip over content that they deem is unimportant or even worse that they're unaware of. The result is that these attitudes are able to persist and be reinforced, especially to high school students. Therefore, I decided to create a peer-to-peer educational tool that addresses the aspects of sexual assault most relevant to Japan. For example, I included consent education as well as information about the harmfulness of victim blaming. This is still a work in progress, and I've attached a sample page here to show you all today. My tool is in a PDF format, and the reason I chose this format is because it allows for flexibility in the learning process. The first way that my tool allows for flexibility is that it allows for peer-to-peer education. Since the information is all included in the PDF, students can educate each other on the topic, such as from an older student to a younger one. Peer-to-peer education is beneficial because research has shown that students are more likely to change their attitudes about topics such as sexual violence if the relayer of the information is somebody who they feel faces similar pressures and concerns. Additionally, in Japan, there's this culture of senpai and kohai, which means that younger students have a deep respect and trust for the older ones. Therefore, peer-to-peer education can be particularly effective. The second way that my tool allows for flexibility is in the learning style. Since the topic is one that is uncomfortable to discuss for many high schoolers here in Japan, with my tool, students can control the size and the composition of the group that they learn in. If they choose to, they can also learn alone. Furthermore, I wanted to ensure that my tool addressed the uncomfortable nature of the topic for many high schoolers in Japan. Therefore, many sections I included a description of why it is essential to discuss a certain topic in order to urge students not to skip over any content that seems uncomfortable to discuss at first. Additionally, for sensitive topics like consent, I even included an alternative way to discuss it if an explicit discussion seems too much to handle in the beginning. So how will I move forward with this? My plan is to first test this tool within my community at my high school in a peer-to-peer education style. Ideally, I would work with small groups of high school students and have multiple sessions with those same groups. I'll constantly be gathering feedback on the receptiveness of my peers, as well as how their attitudes toward the crime change over time. I also plan on training fellow students how to teach this material. After gathering feedback from my school, my hope is that I can expand to other Japanese high schools. To make my tool accessible to both communities, my plan is to translate the content into Japanese. This ties to what I was saying earlier in that there is not much published specific to Japan around this issue. Much of the information about sexual assault is available in English. Therefore, by translating my content, my hope is to bridge the gap between these two communities. Although sexual assault is an uncomfortable topic to discuss, education about it must be implemented in high schools. Sexual assault education not only teaches young people how to protect themselves, but it also teaches them how to support others who may be survivors of this crime. Only by normalizing the discussion around sexual violence can we hope for a better environment for survivors in Japan. Before I end, I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth, Subal, and Tyler for all their support through this process. Thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to ask me any questions.
Hey, great job. All right, so we have one question already for Karen. So the question is, what do you think the attitudes of Japanese women are with regard to sexual assault / misconduct? Do you think some Japanese women are so used to these inequalities that they don't realize it?
Yes, so actually one form of sexual assault that happens very often is, for example, like groping on the train. And through my research, what I found is that many Japanese women and mostly high school girls are unaware that this counts as a form of sexual assault. So I think in terms of the smaller, not smaller, but not less significant, but for example, like groping on the train, I do think that the culture has made it so that high schoolers and like mainly girls are kind of have come to accept this as just the way that the culture works, and they don't really identify it as a big issue.
Thank you. Any other questions for Karen on her project? Yes, we've got another one. Do you think parents are just as responsible to educate / discuss topics on sexual assault as their children's peers?
Yes, thank you for your question. I do believe that parents hold a lot of responsibility in the ideas that get passed down to their children. However, in terms of, because many parents of this generation kind of have grown up with that, assuming that they've grown up with those same attitudes that have been reinforced to their children, I think that if children are able to learn about sexual assault through a more structured and educational system that has context and guidelines for what needs to be covered, that can actually enforce a more maybe forward-looking take on this issue, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Any other questions for Karen? All right. If not, we'll thank her again for her time. Thank you, Karen. Great job.
Thank you.